So before we talk about Elijah today, I would like for us to talk about us. I'm going to ask you some questions. Basically, we're taking a survey here. So raise your hand if you can answer yes to the questions that I ask. Who has parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who fought the Nazis or worked in factories that supplied the fight against fascism? Anybody? A lot of people, right? Who here marched or protested for civil rights back in the day? Yeah. Who protested the Vietnam War or stood with the peace movement? Yes, sir. Who stood up for women's liberation or fought for reproductive freedom? I guess even back then, or more recently too, it turns out. Who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 or 2012, believing, yes, he's inspirational, yes, he is the best orator of several generations, I think, but believing that it might mark a turning point toward racial healing in America? Who was there? Right there. Who celebrated when marriage equality finally became the law of the land? And who lined up as soon as they could for the COVID vaccine out of care for your community? Thank you. So if your hand went up for any of those at all, then you have no doubt felt, as I have, alternating pangs of despair and helplessness and exhaustion over the past 9 months, as we have already watched so much of that work come unraveled. Long settled questions are settled no more. Questions like, were the Nazis bad? Right? That was a question that we once had a lot of consensus around, but seemingly no longer. Rights we fought for are being questioned. Progress we prayed for is being reversed, and hope we carried for our country's future is being smothered. Starting on a really light note this morning. One might very well say that we are having an Elijah moment. You see, Elijah, he was the OG of grassroots activists. The Old Testament doesn't give us much in the way of a biography for the guy, but it does tell us that he came from a place called Tishbe in Gilead. And to call Tishbe a rural backwater is actually to pay it a compliment. It was a place so small and so insignificant that archaeologists still don't know exactly where it was because it didn't leave behind a footprint. It was just a bunch of little wood huts and some animals, and that was it. So coming from a nowhere backwoods kind of place like Tishbe, we can assume that Elijah was either a subsistence level farmer or herdsman, just like everyone else in his podunk village would have been. So in other words, he was a poor, working class kind of guy. And despite having no training or background or connections, when Israel's administration was taken over by a king named Ahab, a king who married a foreign princess named Jezebel, and that is the Jezebel that you may have heard of. But along with Jezebel, King Ahab welcomed into Israel the worship of the deity of her homeland, a god by the name of Baal. And when that happened, Elijah knew that he had to do something, even though he was just a backwoods farmer. In fact, it was at God's behest that he immediately got to work trying to call Ahab and all of Israel back to the worship of their God, the God of Israel, the God that had saved them from their bondage in Egypt. And it should be noted that Elijah wasn't alone in this work. There was a whole community of prophets that were working to the very same end. But that administration, it seems, they didn't care much for free speech. The First Amendment certainly was not a thing in Iron Age Israel. And so Queen Jezebel set out to execute Elijah and all of his kindred prophets, causing them to have to go into hiding. 3 years later, though, God instructed Elijah to come out of hiding again. And when he does so, he finds that he is the only prophet left. It is now up to him and him alone to go and confront King Ahab. And the way that confrontation goes down is the stuff of legend. And just a little aside here, I'm going to invite you to read this. This is in 1 Kings chapter 18. As I visualize it happening, It happens like the cabinet battles happen in Hamilton. I actually had ChatGPT write one, a rap battle, that will be released on Facebook after the service. So if you haven't liked us on Facebook, go ahead. What are you doing on the internet if you don't like us on Facebook? So that'll be up for your perusal later on. But this is how it goes down. People from all over Israel assemble on the top of Mount Carmel, and they watch Elijah go head to head. It's Elijah versus 450 prophets of Baal. And the basic premise was that each of them were going to call on their God, and whatever God answered with fire was the true God. So the 450 prophets of Baal, they slaughtered a bull, and they prayed and they shouted to Baal all morning long, but nothing happens. Around about noon, Elijah starts taunting them. And this is what he actually says. He asks them if their God is asleep. He asked them if maybe their God is off using the bathroom. And this kind of sets off the prophets of Baal. They start going crazy. They're calling out to their God. They're screaming. They're even cutting themselves to show their devotion, all to no avail. But when evening comes along, Elijah rebuilds an altar to the God of Israel that had been long neglected and had fallen into disrepair. And he sets wood all around it. He has the bull that was slaughtered earlier in the day brought over, and he throws that on top. And when all that was done, he had it all doused with water. Not once, not twice, but 3 times until there's puddles all around it. And then he says a short prayer to God, and you can probably see where this is going, but fire immediately descends from the sky. It consumes the wood, the bull, and every drop of water that had poured out. It even consumes the stones of the altar. Now we need to remember that Elijah worked this miracle in front of a huge gathering of his fellow Israelites, a gathering that included the king of Israel himself. If anything was going to change things, if anything was going to change the course that his country was headed on, it was going to be this moment. After years of preaching and risking his life, this was going to be the turning point. He had done it. Elijah had won. But then Elijah woke up the next morning to find that absolutely nothing had changed. Jezebel was still in power, and when she heard what had happened, she sent a messenger to him with the sunny promise that by this time tomorrow, you, Elijah, will be dead. And so that is where our reading picks up this morning, with Elijah on the lam, running for his life, running out into the desert, running until his legs give out, until his adrenaline run dry, until he collapses under a broom tree, and he whispers, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." Now, this isn't Elijah being whiny. This isn't him just being exhausted. Rather, this is what it sounds like when you've run out of hope. This is what it sounds like when you've worked hard and you have done everything right, and the needle hasn't budged an inch, not even a centimeter. This is what it sounds like when you have dedicated your whole life to something good, and yet you're still left wondering if it matters at all. And so how does God respond to Elijah in this moment of despair? God responds not with a lecture, not with a rousing, go and get him slugger, Ted Lasso style inspirational speech. No, God sends an angel, just an angel with bread and water, and that's it. Get up and eat, the angel says, otherwise the journey will be too much for you. So Elijah eats, he rests, he eats again. This moment is simple, it's tender, and it is exactly what he needs in the moment. Thus replenished, Elijah walks to Mount Horeb, a.k.a. Mount Sinai, a.k.a. the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments. And he climbs the mountain, and as he gets up to the top, he steps out into wind that rips at the rocks. He feels the ground shake beneath his feet. He watches fire race across the sky. But God is not in any of that. But then comes the sound like silence, a still, small voice. And that is actually where Elisha finds God. Not in a fix, not in a promise of results, not in a grand miracle, but in a gentle reassurance. I am here. I'm here when the plan works. I'm here when it doesn't. I'm here when your efforts change things. I am here when nothing changes at all. I am here when everything works out. And I am here when everything falls apart. And only after that simple reassurance does God send Elijah back into the world, not to pick up where he left off, but rather to start sharing his work. Elijah is to anoint 2 new kings, and he is to tap in a new prophet whose name is confusingly Elisha, not Elijah, just to make things interesting for you. In other words, he goes to find people who will stand with him and share in his work, which is to say that the answer to burnout is not a bigger, better miracle, but rather the answer to burnout is better community. Rest your body, listen for God in the quiet, and then go and find your people. That is the lesson that God teaches Elijah in this morning's teaching. This is also a lesson that one William Wilberforce had to learn the hard way. Wilberforce entered the British Parliament all the way back in 1780 when he was but 21 years of age. But then somewhere in his mid-20s, he experienced what he called a great change in his life. And Wilberforce had always been a Christian, but somewhere in his mid-20s, he actually started to feel it in his heart. And with this newfound zeal inside, he found that it was fixed on a single goal. And that goal was to end Britain's slave trade. He felt that that is what God was calling him to do. And so to achieve that lofty end, he began working like a man on fire, gathering evidence, speaking for hours in front of Parliament, and introducing abolition bills again and again and again. But again and again and again, those bills got shot down. They were never passed, and he started to get openly mocked by his peers who called him naive and unrealistic. And as these defeats started to stack up, his health took a decline, and in his journals he began to comment how his spirits were low and how he felt unequal to the task to which he was called. But at the invitation of a friend, Wilberforce moved to a place in London called Clapham Common. Does anybody know where that is? Thank you. It's a real place, I'm told. And moving there, he joined in with a small circle of like-minded Christians. So they prayed together, they drafted pamphlets and petitions, they raised funds, and they managed a campaign of public pressure. So when Wilberforce was ill or discouraged, this group was able to keep the work going. And with that community at his back, the movement he started finally broke through. And in 1807, while it didn't abolish slavery outright, the British Parliament did outlaw the buying and selling of slaves. Wilberforce then retired from Parliament in 1825, but the network that he created, it kept the movement going. Those friends that he sought out, they kept the movement going. And in 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, abolishing slavery across the British Empire and freeing some 800,000 people across the globe. And in what is really a made-for-sermon moment, Wilberforce received the news on the day that the act passed, and then he died just 3 days later. Right? Made for a sermon. 3 days. I'll break that out on Easter too. That's great. So friends, the point of this all is that the people of God are not immune to burnout or hopelessness or despair. Elijah felt all of that underneath the broom tree, and Wilberforce felt all that after years of defeat. But God met Elijah with bread and water in that quiet, I am here, And God met Wilberforce through a circle of friends who would not let the work rest on his shoulders alone. And God continues to meet our need today. So when your hope feels thin, rest, eat, be replenished, listen for God in the silence, and then go find your people to help share the load. That is how hope stands up, and that is how the work goes on. Friends, in Jesus' name, may it be so. Amen.